Reese, are you going to email me a revised version of the agenda? Okay.
Yes, I just posted on the EBB and I was just about to send it to you.
Okay, very good. Thank you. All right, well, my clock says 9:30, so I think it's time for us to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Senate Law and Justice Committee. We are gathered today for what I hope might be our very last virtual session. Senator Patton and I are hoping that we'll be able to get together in person by September, October, and then, of course, we'll be together for Assembly Days and hopefully forever thereafter. Our purpose today is to do a work session on a number of firearms related issues, and we will begin that in just a second. But before we do so, I'm going to ask the members who are present to introduce themselves. And Senator Patton, if we could start with you.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Peterson. And I am Senator Mike Patton. I represent the 4th Legislative District. Usually I just mentioned the cities of Liberty Lake and Spokane Valley and Millwood, but I did want to add some rural areas that I represent: Green Bluff, Mount Spokane, and Newman Lake.
Well, thank outstanding. In the absence of the gentleman from the 6th District, it's good to have some geography lessons for all of us. Thank you very much. Senator Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Senator Keith Wagner, representing the 39th Legislative District, east parts of Skagit and Snohomish County, and parts of King County.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Senator Dingra.
Good morning. I'm Dingra, State Senator representing the 45th Legislative District, which is the King County parts of the city of Woodinville, parts of the city of Redmond, Kirkland, Sammamish, and Jubal, and very proud to be the vice chair of this fine committee.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Senator Darnielle.
Good morning, everyone. Jeannie Darnielle. I represent the Tacoma area in the 27th Legislative District, which also includes the small town of Ruston.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And Senator Cooter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. I'm Patty Cooter from the 48th Legislative District, representing parts of Redmond, Kirkland, Bellevue, and all of Hunts Point, Yarrow Point, Medina, and Clyde Hill.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. And I am Jamie Peterson from the 43rd District. All right, so we are going to go ahead and begin with a briefing by Shani Bauer, who is going to give us a brief overview of the changes that we've made in the law regarding firearms since the passage of Initiative 594 in 2014. And Shani, take it away.
Good morning, Chair Peterson, members of the committee. For the record, Shani Bauer, staff counsel to this committee. And as the chair stated, I will be talking about firearm laws that have passed in the state since Initiative 594, both by the legislature and through initiatives. So first, just to lay the land a little bit in terms of where we were at before Initiative 594. Firearm dealers were required to have a license to sell firearms, and of course that is still the case today. Certain persons are prohibited from possessing firearms, primarily those convicted of a felony, certain DV misdemeanor offenses, and persons involuntarily committed for mental health treatment. Firearm dealers are required to conduct a background check prior to transferring a firearm to an unlicensed person. That background check will differ depending on the type of firearm. For pistols and handguns, that is a state or enhanced background check. And for long guns and rifles, that is a NICS check that can be done by the dealer. No regulation regarding the transfer of firearms between unlicensed individuals was required at that time. Moving to the next slide. In November of 2014, the people passed Initiative 594. that initiative required a background check for all firearm transfers, unless specifically exempted by federal or state law. The transfer of firearms between unlicensed individuals was required at that time, or is now required to be facilitated by a dealer. Certain transactions are exempted from that requirement, such as gifts between family members, the transfer of antique firearms, inheritances, and the temporary transfer of firearms. Go ahead and next slide. Thank you. So instead of walking through chronologically the law changes, I divided these up into broad categories. So the first category is background checks and eligibility. Firearm dealers are now required to report to WASPIC when an ineligible person attempts to purchase a firearm. WASPIC keeps statistics of those attempted purchases and of course has reported on those before this committee in the past. In 2018, the crime of harassment was added to the list of DV misdemeanor convictions that prohibit possession of a firearm. And then in November of 2018, the voters once again spoke with Initiative 1639 and required enhanced background checks for the purchase and transfer of semi-automatic assault rifles. Now, as I said, long guns and rifles required just a NICS or federal background check. This carved out a portion of basically the rifles that now require that state enhanced background check. Also, by virtue of Initiative 1639, a person under the age of 21 is prohibited from purchasing a semi-automatic assault rifle. And then in 2020, the state established a centralized background check system within the Washington State Patrol. Dealers will be required to utilize that system within 30 days notice that the system is operational. And you will be hearing from the Washington State Patrol today on the status of that system. Next slide, please. So definition of a firearm, various laws have changed with regard to what is included in the firearm regulations. In 2018, the manufacture, sale, purchase, or possession of a bump fire stock was prohibited. In 2019, criminal penalties were established for undetectable and untraceable firearms. That was basically to address the manufacture of firearms through the use of 3D printers. And then background check procedures were established for the sale or transfer of a firearm frame or receiver, similar to the sale or transfer of a pistol, and that occurred in 2020. Next slide. Various regulations have passed with regard to concealed pistol licenses. A concealed pistol license is good for a period of 5 years, and when that comes up for renewal may not immediately come to a person's attention. So DOL was required in 2017 to start mailing notices to license holders when their expiration and renewal period is coming up. The categories of protection orders that make a person ineligible to possess a concealed pistol license were broadened in 2018. That was to be, in many ways, to make that consistent with how it works for possession of a firearm. Law enforcement is required to confirm a person's eligibility prior to returning that CPL when it's been surrendered or impounded. And then finally, authorization for a dealer to deliver a pistol to a purchaser that produces a valid concealed pistol license prior to completion of the state background check is removed. Prior to that time, the dealer could deliver the pistol just on completion of a NICS or federal background check. The FBI conducted an audit and determined that that was a violation of our NICS agreement. And so we removed that provision in 2019. That law expires June 30th, 2022. It is believed that the centralized background check will be operational by that time, which would essentially resolve that issue. Moving on. Possession or open carry. Criminal liability was established for the failure to safely secure a firearm in 2019. That was also part of Initiative 1639. In 2020, a person is prohibited from possessing a firearm on the premises of any licensed child care center or facility. And just this last session, a person is prohibited from the open carry of a firearm at or near a public demonstration or on the Capitol grounds. Next slide. Quite a few changes have been made with regard to protection orders and mental health. And again, by initiative, vote of the people, the process is established for a family or a household member to petition the court for an extreme risk protection order, also known as an ERPO, to prevent the person from having possession of a firearm. In that case, the court is authorized to issue a warrant for the seizure of firearms in that person's possession. In 2019, procedures were established for the surrender of firearms and CPLs pursuant to other protection, restraining, or no contact orders, is making that process consistent with what is allowed for ERPOs. And then in response to a firearm violence work group, a recommendation was adopted by the legislature, and it authorized the court to enter an ERPO against a person under the age of 18. Notice is required to be provided to the child's parent or guardian to safely secure any firearms. Compliance hearing processes are established with contempt or court proceedings for persons who fail to surrender firearms as required by a protection order in 2020. And then also in 2020, the Washington Office of Firearms Safety and Violence Prevention was established within the Department of Commerce, and that office was established or up and running in March of this year, and you will hear from the director of that program today as well. Moving on to the final slide regarding mental health. In 2018, a process was created for a person who may be in crisis to voluntarily waive his or her firearm rights, and a process to then later revoke that waiver. In 2019, when a court is dismissing non-felony charges because a person is incompetent to stand trial, the court is also required to determine whether a person has a history of violent acts. If that determination is made in the affirmative, the person is then prohibited from possessing a firearm. Finally, a person detained for 72 hours under the Involuntary Treatment Act is prohibited from possessing a firearm for 6 months following detention. That right does automatically reinstate after 6 months. And with that, I would be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you very much, Shani. That is a great overview and appreciate your work on putting that together. And maybe more generally, we should say just about all of those bills you had to either draft or write reports on or whatever. So many thanks to you and Tim for the substantial work over the last few years. Do members of the committee have questions for Shani? I'm not seeing, oh, Senator Cooter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's actually just a request for Shani. If you wouldn't mind sending us those slides, that would be very helpful.
And those they're posted on EBB now, so you can,
great, thank you.
Can get those, but I'm sure we could also email them.
There is a summary handout as well that contains a little more detail and the reference to the actual law that passed as well.
Okay, very good. Any other questions? All right, seeing none, thank you very much, Shani. We'll go ahead and call up our first panel. We're going to hear from Rebecca Johnson, Brett Bass, Kate Kelly, Sandra Shanahan, and Kimberly Wyatt. And for folks who are presenting today, during your panel, if you can make sure to have your video and audio on so that we can see you, that would be great. And Rebecca, I see you, so why don't you just go ahead.
Wonderful. Good morning, Chair Peterson, Ranking Member Padden. It is a pleasure to be here. And my gosh, Shani, that presentation, we have done so much together since universal background checks were passed. I'm going to keep my comments relatively high level. You're going to be hearing throughout the day from folks who are practitioners who are working on the ground day to day with a lot of these laws and with the communities that they impact. But I thought it would be helpful to maybe talk through some of the things that we've learned, some of the ways that these laws were created, and also as we look forward, what we'd like to work together with you to do, and some of the framework for that. So Shani kind of clumped the laws together in one way. I think of them I guess I think about them in a slightly different frame. At the Alliance, we have been focused since the very beginning, since we started working on background checks in 2013, on keeping firearms out of dangerous hands. So identifying where there are circumstances or past behaviors or things that we can tell that could be future indicators of violence. Identifying situations where the presence of a firearm creates a heightened risk. And that could be situations where there are children, or crisis situations where having a firearm, if someone's in a suicidal crisis or a situation that could escalate, that the presence of a firearm could mean the difference between life and death. We're also super focused on making sure that as we're crafting policies, we are using the best available research, basing it on evidence, and always focused on the outcome of reducing gun violence and keeping our communities safe. And as these laws have evolved, I would say one of the very most important things that we do and continue to do is to think about how the laws are being implemented. Are we getting the outcomes that we wanted to from those laws? Are we creating ways to actually measure whether we're being successful? And then are we interacting with the folks who actually have to enforce, implement, interact with the laws to make sure that they are working as intended, or that they're able to implement them, or that they have the resources to do it? So I'll start just to touch on a couple of things that Shani mentioned about keeping guns out of dangerous hands. We've recognized, I think, as a community and a state and a country, that there are some situations or some events that are good indicators of future violence. Domestic violence protection orders, folks who've been previously convicted of violent felonies, some of the violent misdemeanors. I think we've done a great job of identifying those and making sure where there were gaps, like the misdemeanor harassment was a gap, where there are gaps, we're closing those gaps. We've done a lot of work around protection orders. Once upon a time, before 2013, 2014, if you were subject to a domestic violence protection order, you were technically prohibited from having a firearm, but there was no way to ensure that those firearms were actually surrendered. And so you've seen a progression of our laws, first saying, okay, let's make sure that there's a way for the court to order that those firearms be surrendered. Let's figure out how to help victims identify what guns are in the house. And then you'll hear from Sandra and Kimberly further down on this panel, understanding what processes actually make sure that the courts and law enforcement and others are talking together to make sure those firearms are removed. So that, I think, almost more than any other area of gun violence prevention law, the protection orders, the domestic violence, sexual assault, extreme risk protection orders, is a place where we really have been in deep dialogue with the folks who are on the ground implementing those laws. And that, that includes victims, making sure that they have the tools they need to keep themselves safe. Another place where we think we identified a gap was the mental health, the involuntary mental health hold law. I think we were at prohibiting firearms after 14 days. And there was some research that emerged nationally that we worked with Senator Cooter really led on this. Research that emerged that showed there was a really heightened risk for folks who had that 72-hour hold, but the risk didn't necessarily last forever. So instead of saying this is a forever firearm prohibitor, you're prohibited from having firearms for 6 months, which is what the research indicated was the highest risk time frame. And then background checks, making sure we're enforcing current law. There's a number of places here where I'm really proud that it's been a bipartisan effort, and we've worked together with the gun lobby and the NRA, gun dealers and others to identify kind of what's working, where we have interests that overlap. And one place was ensuring we were enforcing current law. We heard a lot from the NRA and others as we started kind of this movement in Washington. Well, what about enforcing current law? We realized we're actually like in this place of background checks that we don't actually have a great system for following up when somebody fails a check. And in that process, we also learned that victims don't necessarily know or have any way to be alerted if their abuser attempted to fire a firearm. So an awesome bipartisan coalition passed that bill, House Bill 1501 a couple of years ago. And now we do have a system, not only to follow up on those checks, but also to provide resources to smaller jurisdictions to make sure that they're able to do that as well. We've done a lot of work in crisis situations, or as I said, situations where the presence of a gun is likely to be deadly or particularly unsafe, where kids are present. We aligned rules for early learning and childcare centers with those for K-12 schools. Just this last year, we passed the bill limiting open carry at the Capitol and at protests. And we've done a lot of work around safe storage and access prevention. And I think this is an important place to know that there's a lot of different approaches to safe storage that have been tried around the country. And as we were developing that law, we really looked to the best available research, and the best law in the books was Florida in terms of reducing gun violence. So the current access prevention law that we have in Washington State isn't prescriptive about exactly how you need to store your gun, but it does say you need to store it, and there will be there could be consequences if a child or anyone else who's prohibited is able to access a firearm that wasn't safely secured. I talked a little bit about making sure our laws are working as intended and looking for places where we can improve. And the protection order space is one where I think we've done a lot of good work. The work that the Safer Homes Task Force that we've been a part of, that I think Brett will be speaking about on suicide prevention, is another place where we're continually looking at our laws, looking at public education. How can we improve knowledge about these laws so that they can help more people? And we've also just after we passed universal background checks, we heard pretty clearly from gun dealers and others that there was just some questions and some places where the law could be more clear about what transfers were required in the case of suicide prevention. We have an interest in making sure folks are able to surrender their firearms to a family member or someone safe. So we worked together to make sure we were being clear on that. And then you'll hear from Kate Kelly from the Office of Firearm Violence Prevention about how we're funding research, community intervention, making sure that we are studying our laws, continuing to work on the foundation that we've built to continue to bend the needle on gun violence prevention. If there's one thing I think we've all learned, is that there's no one law that's going to solve gun violence. But we have, I think, in the conversation and collaboration with you all in the legislature, with community leaders, with law enforcement, victim advocates, survivors, families, and our national partners, I think done a really good job of, as much as we can, closing loopholes, making sure that our laws are working to reduce gun violence in the way that we intend, and continuing to seal gaps and work on better implementation where needed. So I'll pause there.
All right, thank you very much. And we'll have time for questions at the end of each panel. In the meantime, Brett Bass and Dr. Jeff Sung has joined us as well from Forefront, and so we'll look forward to hearing from both of you next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen of the committee. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Brett Bass, and I manage the Safer Home Suicide Aware program for Forefront Suicide Prevention. I'll restrict my commentary to the parts of this I think are the most directly relevant to what we do within the field of suicide prevention. One small thing I just would like to tip my hat toward. It's been a great pleasure to work with a lot of the folks that are in this work session, and it's nice to be able to see a lot of folks again that I haven't necessarily been able to see in quite some time. So the work we've done with the Safer Homes Task Force was directed by the state legislature back in 2015, 2016, somewhere thereabouts, and it focuses on lethal means safety. So lethal means safety, to sort of orient everyone to this, is one of the clinical interventions which is known to reduce suicide at meaningful levels. The idea being that even if somebody is actively suicidal with a plan, if they don't have access to something fatal in a moment of crisis, they're probably not going to die. So the work that we've done with Safer Homes has largely been focused on promoting lethal means safety in communities with high rates of firearms ownership. Although we don't restrict ourselves exclusively to firearms, there's also a somewhat robust medication safety component to what we do as well. So we'll go to community events. Clearly, this hasn't happened as much in 2020 due to the lack of large community events, but we'll go to community events. We're most famous for our work in gun shows, for example, and we'll distribute gun safes, medication lock boxes, and things of that nature to the public at no cost in exchange for them completing a survey about their beliefs and practices in regards to suicide and secure firearms and medication storage, and then give them some basic suicide prevention education. And we're pleased that we found a statistically significant improvement in locking behaviors for both firearms and medications within participant populations, and we published the results of this in the Journal of Injury Prevention in October of last year. And if anyone's curious about that, I'd be happy to forward the study along. So we interacted with well over 1,000 people in 2019. 2020, clearly we hit something of a speed bump, and we have not interacted with quite as many folks, but we're pleased to continue working on it. And we worked on some innovative ways to be able to virtually deliver the intervention in some other settings that might get us access to especially rural parts of the state in which there might not be, for example, VA hospitals or things of that nature that we can generally partner with. So we're enthusiastic about the work we have moving forward. So anyway, a couple of other small things that we've accomplished. The Department of Licensing, of course, is required to send out notifications of concealed pistol license renewal within a certain time frame before the license itself expires. And one of the things that we're very proud about is that suicide prevention information has now been included with that, along with the packet on Washington state laws pertaining to firearms. There had previously been a page at the beginning of that, so this space left intentionally blank. We've now included some Safer Homes related suicide prevention information there. So now those that are issued concealed pistol licenses, and Washington state has a uniquely high rate of concealed pistol license issuance, now get some information about suicide prevention, as well as the notice that they're licensed to be renewed. So the Safer Homes work has largely been guided by a task force created by the state legislature. It is due to sunset at the end of this month. So I'll only be a direct legislative organ for another couple of weeks, at which point I become a free agent. I can more closely identify with my University of Washington employers for good or ill, depending on which side of the state you're on. That might get you some either applauds or criticisms. So if you're a Coug, then well, is what it is. Anyway, a lot of what we want to focus on is on culture change. Our whole idea with what we're attempting to do is to inform people of risks, educate them on best practices, and then provide them with physical equipment so that they can make better changes. And I like to analogize this to why people wear seatbelts. Generally speaking, it is less so the case that people choose to wear seatbelts because they don't want to get a speeding ticket, and more so the case that they don't want to die if they get into a vehicle collision. So that's what we're sort of focusing on with the Safer Homes work. And we have a variety of other trainings that we've put together. One of the things that we are looking to do more of moving forward is partner with firearms retailers more directly. We're in the final stages of putting together a suicide prevention certification process for industry. Hopefully by the end of this month, our training department at Forefront will have given their final blessing to our training product, and we have 3 finalist ranges that we are planning on certifying as compliant with having been trained in basic suicide prevention measures at the business level. Some of this was also addressed with Substitute House Bill 1181, which did not exit committee this last legislative session, but we're still interested in exploring possibilities for encouraging businesses to participate in temporary firearm storage behaviors, because some of the literature that we have that I'm sure Jeff can speak about later indicates that peer-to-peer help seeking is more common than seeking help from institutions. So I think that's all I have to say about the secure storage aspects with means safety that we've been working on. The temporary emergency transfers amendment that we passed in 2017, I think, is some of the best work that we've been able to complete with the Safer Homes Task Force. I'm delighted that Rebecca was able to mention that. And I think that was indicative of a genuine bipartisan effort to solve a gap that we saw that was obvious to all parties involved in this. So to better contextualize that, it was not clear within the original phrasing of I-594 that a temporary transfer between private individuals who are legally able to possess firearms for the purpose of preventing a suicide in compliance with the clinical best practices was lawful. And so our amendment in 2017 went through a number of revisions during the negotiation process, and we wound up with verbiage that we think is concise, simple, very easy for people to understand, and easy for me to tell other people about in public. So part of what we do at the Safer Homes events out in the field is also advising people that this is the case, that they don't need to try going through a licensed dealer in order to perform a temporary transfer for the purpose of preventing a suicide, and letting people know that they're protected by the law to help each other on a peer-to-peer basis. I think that's about it for the parts that I'd like to discuss. There's some parts of this that I think are better spoken to by Dr. Sun, since he is a clinical psychiatrist. And so I will turn my microphone over to him.
Great, thank you very much. Dr. Sun, please proceed.
Hi, thank you so much for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak. I'm here mainly just to support and speak a little bit high level about it. I think that when Brett and I discussed this and we're thinking about the gaps in the firearm-related injury and fatality prevention, I think that the gap in the space within which we work is that in Washington State, firearm fatality is going to look like about 75% suicide. And then suicides are going to tend to look like about 85% male, those firearm-related suicides. And then, so it's male gender, Caucasian race, longstanding, pre-existing, and legal firearm ownership. And so there's data out of Utah that looked at firearm suicide decedents and whether or not they would have passed the background check, indicating that about 92% of them would have passed the background check on the day of their death. So I think that the space that we work in and the lens that we work through is how are we addressing the majority of the problem? And the majority of problem has this sticky, difficult, longstanding, pre-existing legal firearm ownership, and typically male, Caucasian, adult. So that's the lens through which we think about things. We think about how laws that might affect firearm regulations will influence the people who are potentially seeking treatment. So Brett and I are both on a law enforcement task force looking at mental health and suicide risk. And this is a huge issue that is brought up repeatedly at those meetings, that the police chiefs are struggling with their law enforcement officers and what are the barriers to treatment. And so the barrier to treatment that will sometimes come up is what will happen to my firearm regulations. So I think these are complicated scenarios and thinking about which populations of people are potentially influenced. And so it's difficult to discuss involuntary treatment and 6-month restriction on firearm regulations with a group of people who are already reluctant to seek treatment. So that's sort of the lens through which we work. We're trying to align with the population at risk and looking at the population at risk as a group of people, longstanding, pre-existing legal firearm ownership, and then thinking about how firearm regulations might influence the people who are potentially seeking treatment. So that's all I'll say about it. Thank you again so much for the invitation. And we love collaboration and think about how we might apply our suicide prevention lens to the regulations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being with us. Sandra Shanahan.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having us, Chair Peterson and the members of the committee. My name is Sandra Shanahan. I'm the program manager of the Regional Domestic Violence Firearms Enforcement Unit. That's right, I have a PowerPoint. We're really grateful that the legislature created laws informed by research that were specifically intended to reduce harm during periods of heightened firearm risk. And even though the passage of those laws were very difficult, we're really only halfway there. And we really believe that the next step should be investing in robust implementation of all of the laws. And so that kind of falls along 3 different planes of raising awareness through education and training, best practices and investments in carrying out the work, and then research and evaluation. So if I can have the next slide, please. So Kim and I are going to be specifically focusing on the laws related to firearm surrender and prohibition for domestic violence offenders and people in crisis. So those specifically related to protection orders. And just for a little bit of grounding, we've just learned a lot since our unit began in early 2018. And one of the most important things that we learned is that domestic violence offenders in our community of King County are disproportionately armed compared to the general public. So their possession rates are double the general public. And we also know from state level research that domestic violence offenders are the most likely to violently recidivate. And then we've heard, based on research and articles from across the country, that there's just something about armed domestic violence offenders and their implications with violent death and injury across our country. And so despite these realities, what we experience here locally and as we meet with partners across the state is that law enforcement and courts are not implementing seamlessly and comprehensively these laws specifically across our state. And we also have a gap where community members are not aware of these laws, how to access them, how to utilize them. So that becomes a big awareness issue. And if I could have the next slide, please. So I think one of the most important things about awareness that we see kind of on the ground and here, and I'm sure every single person on this panel has heard about, we just have myths related to firearms and suicide, specifically in domestic violence homicide. And so I just wanted to kind of start from that place of trying to tease out some of the facts around these specific incidents. And so I think everyone on this call has heard somebody say at some point, well, if somebody really wants to kill themselves, or if they really want to kill their intimate partner and you take the gun away, they're just going to find some other means. But the reality is the research has found the exact opposite of that. And so what we know about suicide is that it is frequently impulsive. But when people are using lethal means, such lethal means like a firearm, it doesn't really give the person in crisis the opportunity to reconsider their actions. And so we worry about people overly broadening that idea that if you take the firearm away, then they'll find another means. And then similarly, we see that or hear that related to domestic violence homicide, this idea that if you take it away, they'll find another means. And there are researchers who specifically have looked at this phenomenon by studying states who have engaged in efforts to remove firearms from domestic violence offenders. And what they found is that overall, there was a decline in intimate partner homicide rates. So they did not see people picking up other types of weapons in those situations. And so if I can have the next slide, please. If we really want to talk about where to begin with implementation, we really need to raise awareness and train both system actors, prosecutors, police, law enforcement, defense attorneys, courts, and the community about the laws, how they've changed, how to carry them out, and where to turn if they encounter a situation where they may need intervention related to firearms. And then what we've learned from our unit is this work is incredibly labor intensive. And so it's important to have funding and resources to work safely and at scale using best practices like multidisciplinary and public health approaches, multi-jurisdictional coordination and cooperation, because we know that firearms are so portable. And then finally, we really want to ensure that there is robust and standardized data collection for research and evaluation to assess whether these laws are being implemented as intended and what they are, whether they are accomplishing what they were designed to do. Because in reality, Without full implementation, we just have laws on the books. And because the legislature worked so hard to get these laws into effect to reduce harm and save lives, we must turn our attention to the next step of implementation. And so with that, I thank you kindly, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kim Wyatt. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Kelly, we're going to put you last on this panel, so we'll hear from Ms. Wyatt next. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Peterson, Ranking Member Padden, distinguished members of the Senate. My name is Kim Wyatt. I'm a Senior Deputy Prosecuting Attorney from King County and part of the Regional Domestic Violence Firearms Enforcement Unit. Thank you for the opportunity to testify and share with you a little bit about our work. As you heard from my colleague Sandra, the ongoing need for education, for training around our firearm laws and specific to domestic violence. And I want to share those similar concerns with you about an area of work that I'm involved in daily, which is our extreme risk protection order of work. So if I can get the first slide, please. So as many of you know, the Extreme Risk Protection Order Act passed by Citizens Initiative in December of 2016. In the first couple of years of its use, December roughly 2016 to 18, I believe there was only a handful of cases used statewide, and so it was widely unknown. And then our unit formed in January of 2018, and then sadly in February, on Valentine's Day, February 14th of 2018, the tragedy at Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida occurred. And that's where we really saw a shift in our work in extreme risk protection orders, was after that shooting or that tragedy. But, you know, still to the date, and we're going to talk about the numbers in a second, you will see that there is an ongoing need for training for law enforcement, for the public to be aware that this is a tool, especially for families and loved ones that have somebody in crisis. So we have been working yearly on various trainings to the community and to law enforcement agencies throughout King County and through the state and some of our federal partners as well. But as Sandra said, laws pass and they do not implement themselves. So we are here as practitioners to say there is a need to make sure that families, especially loved ones that have a loved one in crisis, are aware that ERPO and some of these other protection orders could be the right tool to intervene to prevent future gun violence. And if I can have the next slide, please. And to best understand this, we really want to talk to you a little bit about the stats of what we're seeing here in King County. So these are specific to King County. These are roughly from 2018 to 20, the extreme risk protection orders that have been filed in our county. So you will see that out of 217 ERPO petitions, which is a fairly small number if you're looking at a population of King County, which is 2.2 million people. So we're roughly working on 70 to 80 ERPO petitions a year that are actually being filed. We vet many, many other ERPOs daily, but sometimes it's not the right use of the tool. But for the ones that are actually being filed over this 3-year time span, it's been 217. And what I think is so telling of these stats is you will see that 207 of these were from law enforcement. And we work closely with law enforcement weekly on extreme risk protection orders, but you will see that there's only 10 family cases that have been filed in King County in the past 3 years. And so that to us tells us that, one, we need to make sure that there's education going on to the community, to medical providers, to crisis line workers, which we have trained, to the VA, to family members, to faith communities, to other outreach groups, to make sure that they're aware that if they have a loved one in crisis, like in a behavioral health crisis, that has potential access to firearms, that an ERPO could be a tool of intervention or one of our other civil protection orders. And so we have made some progress in this in regards to this. In 2020, we were able to get funding to help fund an ERPO advocate. And so she has been working on doing outreach and then is able to assist families that reach out to our unit that have questions about ERPO as a tool. And we're also getting sometimes from therapists that have questions about a patient or a client and have concerns. And so we are making some efforts on outreach, but we believe that there's more that needs to be done on a state level. And if I can get the next slide, please. And something we wanted to share with you as well is just a little bit about what type of ERPO petition that we're seeing here in King County. And we started to track these in 2018, and we broke it down into categories of various types of harm. So you will see that we are measuring threats to self-harm, so cases of suicidal ideation, straight threats to others, and then the combination of the two. And in 2018, almost half of our cases that we were working on were threats of suicide. In 2019, for whatever reason, there was a shift a little bit. And so more cases were coming in regarding threats to others, or that combination of self-harm and then threats to others as well. And then if we can look at the next slide, please. And then in 2020, there was a big shift. And I can't tell you exactly why that is, but it could be some increase in law enforcement training, but I'm not, we just are tracking these numbers. And so what we saw was almost half of the cases that we were working on for ERPOs were straight threats to others, including some cases involving threats of mass violence. So threats to the workplace, threats to other public places. And I would say in 2021, which we don't have those stats for you today, but just based on my experience, we are seeing a mix of both increased cases of threats of self-harm and then threats of mass violence or threats to others as well. If I can have the next slide, please. And then finally, just an issue that we wanted to highlight for you from a practitioner standpoint, and something that the last time we were talking with you, we did not, weren't aware really of this issue, is the increase in cases that we are seeing of untraceable firearms, or this concern with ghost guns. And that is coming across in both our extremist protection order work, our domestic violence protection order cases, and then even some of our felony cases as well. And so it raises a concern for us that individuals may be purchasing these 80% lowers that aren't technically a firearm until they've been drilled, the holes have been drilled or milled out. And we believe it could be in part to get around some of the background checks. We've also had cases, a small number of cases where there's allegations of individuals 3D printing firearms. But I would say the homemade or the assembling the firearms themselves is the type of issue that we're seeing on a weekly basis. And as practitioners, as a prosecutor, it raises some concerns, obviously, for public safety, and particularly concerned when we've had individuals subject to our protection orders and extremist protection orders that are either attempting to purchase a suppressor, a silencer, or buying other firearm accessories when we know that they're prohibited from doing so. So we wanted to raise that issue because that's something that we are seeing in our work, and we're happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you both for the presentation and for all of your work. And now we will hear from Ms. Kelly to round out this panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I do have a presentation. So you can go to the next slide, Reese, please. So I'm Kate Kelly. I was appointed in March by Lisa Brown to head up the Office of Firearm Safety and Violence Prevention. The office is located in the Department of Commerce. It's consistent with the programs we're already doing very intensely with the communities in our state, and fits in nicely with the crime victims and public safety work that we're already doing. So it's been an exciting fit for us. Next slide, please. So this office was created in 2020 by the legislature, and the purpose is to, among other things, coordinate firearm violence and intervention and prevention efforts that are going on statewide. There hasn't been an entity within our state to do that kind of work. And so it's an exciting time to kind of be thinking about setting up that program. Next slide, please. There's some very particular things that the office is tasked with doing and that we have already started doing, but we'll be doing more robustly as the months and years go by. We're networking statewide programs. I've been trying to inventory what's out there. we just yesterday held our first convening of some of the statewide programs. Very robust, very rich discussion. Senator Dinger participated, and so we'll be doing much more of that. It was very well received. We're going to be helping with best practice guidance, technical assistance. We will be convening some smaller, but some hoping to do also a bigger gun violence summit at some point, in addition to trainings for either directed specifically at particular communities or statewide trainings that'll be offered, bringing in whatever experts we need. You've heard already about some of the data needs this morning. Clearly, there's a need to, number one, inventory what gun violence data is out there, and then identify some of the gaps and figure out what we can do to fill them. We know that there are jurisdictional challenges with how data is collected and how it's counted and labeled. And so the office is tasked with helping to bring that together. We've already started discussions with administrative office of the courts and University of Washington and others to work on that. We'll be reporting back to you biannually. Our first report is due in December, so hopefully we'll have a lot more to say by then, and make policy recommendations too, which we're directed to do by the statute. Last but not least, we will be standing up a grant program. That grant program is focused on community gun violence, which I'll talk about in a minute. And it's a very particular kind of firearms violence that we'll be addressing. Next slide, please. So funding, this lists some of the sources of just general firearms violence funding that's being distributed in the state. So our office got some funding for operating, and then this just concluded session, we also received funding that we'll use as seed money to stand up the grant program. In addition, the legislature has, in the past couple of years, adopted budget provisos to send particular funds to particular communities and programs. And so those have gone either through Commerce or through DCYF, in particular there through their juvenile justice programs in terms of gang intervention. There's also funding going to the University of Washington for their firearm injury and policy research program, which was started up in 2019, and Senator Brock led the effort to get that program stood up, and we'll be working very closely with them, particularly on the data issues. Finally, it's important to mention that we're seeing a strong emerging federal support for this type of work. The new administration has come in strong on it. They've changed guidance for existing federal funding programs, and they've also allocated pools of money for community violence intervention. And so our office will be looking closely at that. We're working with the governor's office and we intend to work with the delegation to figure out how to best leverage that federal support. Next slide, please. So as you've heard about this morning, there are different kinds of firearm violence that require very different strategies in terms of fixing them, or at least beginning to address them. Community, sometimes called urban violence, is what the grant program for the Office of Firearms Safety and Violence Prevention will be focusing on. And that is violence that's in the streets among victims and perpetrators who are not intimate partners. So it's kind of by exclusion on the street violence. Next slide, please. So in order to address that sort of violence, we need to know where it's occurring. And this map came from the Department of Health, And what it shows is firearms homicides throughout the state. As you can see, many of the districts that you all represent are hot spots in our state. It's not really a surprise that those are some of the areas that have the higher population. This homicide statistics include domestic violence homicides, but the hot spots are the ones where we are seeing community gun violence out in the streets. And so these are the areas where the office will be focusing, particularly the grant funds that we'll be administering, but also much of our outreach effort. Next slide, please. So community violence requires and you've heard, I don't need to go into this too much, but you've heard it requires very particular strategies to address it. It causes trauma. It takes a high physical and mental toll on communities where it occurs. It's in very particular neighborhoods, very particular small pool of folks. And so it disproportionately affects communities of color. So there's an equity component to this work and heightened importance for us to focus on it. And one thing to know, in contrast to the presentations you heard earlier about domestic violence and suicide, in the case of community street violence, it often involves weapons that are not in the normal course of commerce. They're either because the folks who are using them are not legally entitled to own a gun because they're underage or felons, or because the guns themselves have been stolen or loaned or not obtained in the normal course of commerce. Next slide, please. So we know how to fix, not how to fix, but how to begin to address these problems. There's very particular evidence-based tools that we can use. Some of these are already being used in our state, but the idea is to figure out what works and continue to build on the work that's going on, and also expand to some of the other hotspots where we're not seeing as active community work going on. Next slide. So finally, I just want to emphasize that this work is done in partnership with many of the people you've already heard from and will be hearing from today. At the state level, our office will be working with all of these different partners and others, many of whom we've already reached out to. And then if you go to the next slide, please. At the community level, we'll need to be working with a whole host of folks there. Every community is different. Their violence issues are different. And we'll need to be adjusting for that and making sure that whatever programs are implemented are community supported. And that'll be part of the work we'll be doing in the months and years to come. We're very excited to be doing this work. There's been a very strong, supportive welcome to us in doing this work and leading this effort. So we appreciate you having the foresight to create the office, and we look forward to working with you in the future to implement it further. That's it.
All right, thank you so much for the presentation and for your work. And we will now pause to see if we have questions from members of the committee for any of the folks on this first panel. And Senator Patton.
Thank you very much, Chair Peterson. Had a question for Ms. Kelly, and I was somewhat fascinated with the map you had of the state and the homicides in that. It seems to me that the per capita gun ownership rates in the rural areas are higher than those in the urban areas. Yet, I guess my point with all that is that perhaps the number of guns in an area is certainly not indicative of criminal violence with guns. In fact, it may be, there's some research shows it may be the opposite. But would you agree there's a number of more complex cultural and social issues? I think you touched on some of them in your presentation that need attention.
Absolutely, yes, and it's a whole cloth solutions that need to be implemented, and some of the community programs that are being implemented across our state are designed to divert individuals from repeated violence and retaliation, but to do that they need to help folks get an education, find jobs, get driver's licenses, get housing, all the things that we need to do to make people have productive lives.
Thank you very much. Senator Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple of questions for a couple of panelists. Is that all right?
Please proceed.
So I wanted to start with Ms. Wyatt about the ERPO threats by type. And she noticed, and I think we all noticed, that the graphs kind of jumped around radically from year to year. So I'm wondering if my science mind makes me wonder if there's a good standard by which we're measuring that, or if it gets a little bit subjective in how those questions or how those categories are formed. It would be interesting to know if you're trying to narrow that down so we get really valid data, or if you have an opinion about why the change is so radical from year to year.
Well, those are great questions. You know, we have researchers that are studying our data, so I'm going to have to defer to some of our partners at the University of Washington, and then also some of our colleagues at Johns Hopkins that are looking at the actual data and can really get into that. This is just our practitioners' approach. And for example, if a case is coming in where somebody's exhibiting threats to harm themselves, and that's in the petition, and then there's also threats to harm somebody else, whether it be a coworker or an intimate partner, or sometimes it's in a direct, you know, I'm trying to think of a case. We've had one where the individual was expressing fantasies about committing a mass shooting that's greater than the Las Vegas tragedy. So that would be threats of mass violence or specific indications of threats to others. So that's how we're categorizing it. But you're absolutely right. I wouldn't say it's scientific. This is very much just practitioner-based, how we are categorizing it. And because we didn't initially do that, we just started to get questions from other folks about what we were seeing. And so it was easiest for us to break it into those three categories. But we're certainly open to doing it a different way and an improved way. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Chair, the second question was for Dr. Sung. I thought I understood him to say that one of the barriers to perhaps pursuing help was the idea that you might lose your firearm. So I wanted to clarify if that was in fact what he meant.
Mr. Chair, if I may, Dr. Sung, so to speak to that, yes, that is definitely one of the recurring themes that we encounter in all the settings in which Safer Homes does its work. So within the context of the law enforcement task force, this is a common fear. One of the challenges, and I do apologize, there's a landscaper mowing immediately outside my window. I'm so sorry. So if this gets impossible to hear, I can summarize again later. I apologize. At any rate, there are genuine real-world negative ramifications from help-seeking behaviors in certain professions. So in the event that you're a law enforcement officer, executive protection agent, member of the armed services, in as much as we're attempting to incentivize people to engage in seeking care, there are real possibilities that firearms rights actually, or at least in perception, can be endangered. Security clearances can be lost, et cetera. So one of the common refrains that we hear in a lot of the settings is like, I don't dare go talk to a therapist because I'm afraid I'm going to lose my firearm rights. So a lot of what we do is engaging in some degree of education, because there is significantly more process than that. Washington State has the great fortune of not being the state of New Jersey in this regard. And so it's a common concern, and education goes some distance in addressing it, but there's still quite a bit of work to be done.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Do we have any further questions from members of the committee? All right, I am not seeing any. So with that, thank you to all of you on that first panel. Appreciate your being here with us. We'll go ahead and call up our second panel, Aveen Klein, Michael Findley, and Dan Mitchell. And Ms. Klein, if you want to go ahead and proceed.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Peterson, Vice Chair Dingra, Ranking Member Padden, and honorable members of the Senate Law and Justice Committee. For the record, my name is Aveen Klein, Washington State Director for the National Rifle Association. On behalf of the more than 5 million NRA members, tens of thousands of which reside in the great state of Washington, thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to address you today to discuss Washington's firearm laws. As you know, the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution guarantees an individual's right to keep and bear arms that shall not be infringed. Article 1, Section 24 of the Washington State Constitution further affirms this right of an individual to bear arms in defense of himself or of the state, which shall not be impaired. These rights are individual guarantees, protections against government overreach. Just as I did when I swore into the bar to become an attorney, each of you as a state senator took an oath to support and defend the constitutions of the United States and the state of Washington, including the right to keep and bear arms. As an overview, we're here today to discuss gun violence and how a comprehensive approach is necessary. Voluntary incentive and education-based programs are the key to be effective. I would like to start by discussing red flag laws, which have already been discussed today. It's important to keep the firearms out of the rights of prohibited persons, but it's also important to simultaneously maintain an individual's right to keep and bear arms. This creates tension. These tensions lead to red flag laws, which are ripe for abuse. Recently, the Supreme Court evaluated firearms confiscation by law enforcement under the Fourth Amendment. In Justice Alito's concurrence, he foreshadowed that these red flag laws may be challenged under the Fourth Amendment and expects these to come in front of the court. I mention this today because it's been a big topic. How do we keep hands out of prohibited persons? How do we protect the public, but also maintain the integrity of the Constitution and the right to keep and bear arms? Additionally, I'd like to talk about mandatory storage, which is often referred to as safe storage. On behalf of the NRA, a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work. As you've heard from panel number 1, a comprehensive evaluation of different needs in different communities are important in order to be sure that we keep firearms out of the hands of prohibited persons or persons who could present a danger to themselves, to their family, or the community. Legal firearm ownership must be protected, and the following are 5 areas where the NRA proactively works to ensure firearm safety for the benefit of the entire community in order to address some of the concerns already raised today. The first is through firearms training. The NRA Firearms Training Catalog provides nearly 50 firearms training courses for beginners to experts, women, self-defense, and for safety. These courses teach knowledge, skills, attitudes necessary for safe handling throughout firearms and ammunition. The NRA trains more than 1 million people throughout the country each year and provides online training programs, which have become increasingly popular with the skyrocketing rate of new gun owners through the COVID pandemic. I welcome panel 1 and any other members of this work session to reach out to the NRA and talk about how we can collaboratively use these approaches for training and community-based incentives. The second is through Eddie Eagle. Eddie Eagle was developed in 1988, and it teaches children pre-K through 4th grade important steps to take if they find a gun. It's an easy to use format, just like stop, drop, and roll. Children are taught by the program's mascot, Eddie the Eagle, to follow simple rules when they encounter a firearm. Stop, don't touch, leave the area, and tell an adult. We worry about children and we worry about firearms. This is an easy, proactive education incentive-based program to teach children about the dangers and the respect firearms demand. Eddie Eagle has reached more than 31 million children in all 50 states, Canada, and Puerto Rico. The NRA has also developed the country's first ever hunter education program. That was done in 1949. Our hunter education course is the most comprehensive program in the country and is offered for free. It's used by your neighbor in the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. It's not currently utilized in Washington. I reference hunting today because this is a growing area of children and what the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife calls the R3 program, an incentive-based program to teach children how to enjoy the outdoors through hunting and fishing. And R3 is a critical component. The NRA also utilizes law enforcement training. We developed the Law Enforcement Division in 1960 specifically to provide law enforcement community with means to certify law enforcement firearms instructors. There's currently 55,000 law enforcement instructors, more than 11,000 of which are active today. I reference these programs for you because it is so critically important when addressing firearms rights and concerns of the community to work together through voluntary incentive-based programs, just like Eddie the Eagle and Project Child Safe, through education, investment into mental health and resources. I do appreciate Ms. Kelly's recognition of the need to evaluate all gun violence research and how to address different forms of gun violence across the state. Crime rates are rising at alarming rates, particularly in large urban cities, as we saw on the map provided earlier. Informed by research when evaluating and implementing the rise of gun violence focuses on actions towards bad actors, criminal activity, and felons. We need to be sure that the ways that we address gun violence do not impair law-abiding firearm owners' rights to keep and bear arms. With that, I welcome bipartisan engagement, law enforcement, agency, and diverse collaboration with all members of this work session and beyond to work towards solutions that do not impair, that do not weaken or damage the Second Amendment or the right to keep and bear arms. Again, thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions from the committee.
Thank you very much. We'll hear next from Mr. Findley.
Thank you, Chairman and committee members. For the record, my name is Michael Findley, and I'm the Director of Government Relations for the National Shooting Sports Foundation. For those of you not familiar with NSSF, we are the Trade Association for America's Firearm Industry. I'm very proud to be here today to talk about this important issue and be part of the solution. Let me first say that no family should have to suffer the loss of a loved one in such a preventable tragedy such as gun violence. It is my personal commitment and the commitment of our industry to educate and provide resources about safe storage and other preventable gun violence situations, while at the same time respecting the right to keep and bear arms and appreciating and acknowledging that every circumstance surrounding the ownership and storage of firearms is unique. To be clear on our position, we support voluntary and incentive-based programs and not mandatory ones. In fact, we've been outspoken advocates for safe storage and suicide prevention, as well as preventing straw purchases and secure FFLs for the entire existence of NSSF. Not only are we advocates, but we put our money where our mouth is, and we provided great resources to ensure that those who should not have guns do not get them. Again, we do not oppose we oppose a mandate which would alienate gun owners, impede state voluntary incentive-based efforts, impair individuals' ability for self-defense with a firearm, and create a vague and virtually unenforceable law that would have legal implications and penalties. Again, we are saddened by every firearm tragedy and truly want to work together on solutions. And this is precisely what I'm here to talk about today, some of our programs. I don't have enough time to get into all of them, but I want to highlight a couple of them for you. We've created Project Child Safe, Operation Secure Store, Don't Lie for the Other Guy, and we partnered with the National Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs to address some of the problems that are plaguing our communities these days. I want to touch base a little bit on Project Child Safe. So Project Child Safe, again, is a voluntary incentive-based program where the industry, from our own dime, provides local law enforcement, to date 15,000 local law enforcement entities in all 50 states and territories with education toolkits, as well as free locks. And our educational programs really are designed to make sure that unauthorized access is eliminated. Those who should not have access to a firearm aren't getting it, and really training and educating gun owners to make sure that if they are not using a firearm, that they are locking them up and making sure that they are secure and not in a position where those who shouldn't have access to them are obtaining them. To date, since 1999, we've given out 40 million locks and safety kits. 15,000 law enforcement agencies around the country have partnered with us on this. That doesn't include the millions and millions of people and FFLs that have accessed our programs through our online portal and gotten these programs and implemented them in their stores. If you go to an FFL right now in Washington, oftentimes you can see our programs and our toolkits available for the general public. And we've encouraged all of our retailers to provide these informations along with every gun purchase and ammunition purchase that they incur. In terms of making sure that people who should not have firearms don't get firearms, we've worked with retailers all over the country on a program called Don't Lie for the Other Guy. This program is we work with former law enforcement who are now consultants with NSSF to give retailers the knowledge that they need to point out who might be purchasing a firearm and what we call a straw purchase, providing a person who is legally able to obtain a firearm going in there and purchasing a firearm for somebody that is not there. Again, that is against federal law, but we want to make sure that we go above and beyond by providing our retailers the education that they need to be able to spot that situation and the tools that they need to be able to deny them from obtaining those firearms for those prohibited people. In addition, we partnered, as I said before, with the Department of Veterans Affairs, as well as the National Foundation for Suicide Prevention, with toolkits, a hotline, as well as more education for our retailers, because we believe that retailers being able to spot somebody in crisis is the best way that we can prevent somebody from obtaining a firearm to use it while they are in crisis for a suicide. While this program is relatively new and it's coming together, we've seen quite great results thus far, and we're excited over the next couple of years to see the program fully help in terms of curbing gun suicides. I know I'm running a little bit out of time, but the final thing that I want to say is the messenger matters. And we're committed to working with this committee and Washington State to ensure that we tackle this problem together. But that being said, mandates coming from the government aren't necessarily trusted by our community. So it's going to take a trusted messenger such as NSSF, who is the firearms industry, to work together to really put these programs in place. And through that trusted messenger, we can really get buy-in from the gun owner community and really start to tackle these issues. If they're just coming down through mandates, they're likely to be ignored. They're likely not to be followed. And quite frankly, if they're not followed or they're not, and they're not really having effect, then it doesn't matter what we do. What we're trying to do here is really stop gun violence and accidents from occurring. So buy-in with our community and getting the right messenger, I think, is going to be critical. And that's why we're here today. We're here today to extend the olive branch and say, we're willing to work with you guys. Let's try these programs where we've seen in other states that really have an effect. And we've seen the numbers. In the last 20 years with accidental discharge, we've seen fatalities go down by 40% since we've implemented Project Child Safe, excuse me. So we have the data that shows that these programs really work. We're open to expanding them. We're open to throwing in more resources, and we're open to collaborating with both the Washington office and Panel One, as well as other FFLs and other groups within Washington that share the same goals. With that, we'll stand for questions. We have other programs as well for all litany of different issues that we're facing. And while we're out of time, we can provide follow-up information as needed.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mr. Finley. We'll hear next from Mr. Mitchell.
Good morning, everybody. Nice to see everybody's smiling faces back here on Zoom again. My name is Dan Mitchell from the 49th Legislative District. I'm the owner of Sporting Systems, a retail firearms establishment down here in Vancouver, Washington. I'm a certified firearms instructor and provided free training to over 70,000 Washington citizens since 2018. I'm also the co-founder of the Washington Civil Rights Association, 100% volunteer nonprofit entity formed to